About a month or two ago, you and I were considering the dramatic accounts of the creation of the world in the book of Genesis. On 3 consecutive Sundays, we considered God's work of making everything there was and is. And along the way, we encountered some contentious issues. We learned lots of important lessons, of course, but also some contentious issues that we tried to deal with in the time that was allowed, like the age of the earth, the theory of evolution, the privileged place of human beings, the way science and faith fit together. Hence the series title, Creation with a Dash of Controversy. But we stopped back in May without finishing. The story is divided into 7 parts, and we only talked about 6. Other important things intervened as life has a habit of getting in the way. Paul Carline encouraged us about caring for refugees one Sunday. The next week, 3 people were baptized and 5 joined the church, and I encouraged you just before we all gathered around the Lord's table to make that kind of decision, those kinds of decisions for God. And last Sunday, our new youth pastor, Jeremy Vincent, preached about our unity in Jesus Christ. But the great creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 has one more section. And today's the day for completing this sermon series and hearing what God has to say to us, especially through Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. But just to get a bit of context, in our Bible reading today, I want to back up a few verses. So let's start to read from chapter 1, verse 24. Genesis 1, verse 24. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air, in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in numbers. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And so the author of Genesis looks back on God's creative work and writes, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array." The heavens and the earth were created in all their vast array. There's a tremendous universe, light years long and spectacularly beautiful, made to perfection by the one God who saved the world in Jesus, who gave the Spirit to his people, who created the world in the first place. And he made a marvelous earth, not just a wonderful, tremendous universe, but a marvelous earth with incredible diversity, crowned with the creation of people in all their uniqueness, and declared the whole thing very good. God made all these things, heavens and earth, everything there was and is, in all their vast array. I think that's the emphasis of this sentence, the vast array, the incredible diversity. God made it all. The next line reiterates this fact. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. After 6 days of work, there's a sense of completion, of satisfaction. It's done. After a long series of creative acts, God folds his arms, sits back, and says, finished, done, made right. You probably have examples in your own work of things that are finally come to an end, tasks that are completed at the end of the day, work that you've been struggling with perhaps, that finally gets done, deadlines to meet, troubles faced, and now finally the work is done. And yes, our jobs differ quite a bit. Many jobs are different day by day. But all of us know, I think, that sense of satisfaction when the dishes are dried and they're all in the cupboard and everything's clean again. When the big project is wrapped up and everybody's on board and powers that be have voted their approval and it's done. When the search committee has interviewed many people and finally arrived at one candidate and moves on to the next step, and well, maybe that's not quite done yet, but we're looking forward to that when that task is finished. And you and I know the satisfaction of completing a work that God has laid out for us. Jesus, of course, is the one who I think of most prominently in this way, because he had a divine mission in mind. He had a task that he had to accomplish. And it was a task that had been prepared through long centuries of laying the groundwork, of setting up the context in the Old Testament, of a sacrificial system that would be the categories in which his death would be described, of creating and making a covenant with people within that agreement, that new relationship that he had in mind, not just for a few people like Abraham and his family, not just the people of Israel, not just the early church, but people like you and me and millions more who need to know about Jesus. That whole idea of a covenant, God had set that up eons ago, so that when Jesus stood behind the supper table that Thursday night and said, "This is a new covenant that I'm making, this death that I'll have tomorrow. This is a new covenant that I'm making in my blood," we would know what it was all about. The Old Testament is important to us. It is the huge context of God's working with God's people. And Jesus came with a mission to accomplish. God wrote himself into the play, became part of the drama, the human drama, and played his part in the important and most significant chapter of the whole play. Living with us, taking on our humanity, experiencing our temptations and sufferings, and then finally going to the cross. And there, as his lifeblood was poured out and the task was coming to an end, he proclaimed with a loud voice, "It is finished." Our salvation was accomplished there. And what remains for us is simply to believe it, to let Jesus have the primary place in our lives. On the seventh day, God had finished the work that he had been doing. On the cross, Jesus had finished the saving work that he had come to do. Just like you and me, just like Adam and Eve and all the rest, God is a worker, and God knows what it's like to have the satisfaction of completing that work. And that dignifies our work. That makes a difference for how we think about our employment. To know that God had work to do, creative work. Jesus had work to do, saving work. You and I have work to do. And in many ways, it's good and important work. But on the seventh day, God rested from his work. We've gone over these, 4 weeks that we've been looking at the opening act of Genesis. We've gone from in the beginning God created to on the seventh day God rested. Rest is the key idea of this whole passage, these 3 verses. The Hebrew scholars tell us that the word doesn't just mean taking it easy. It means making a definite stop when the work is done. It's the rest of achievement, not inactivity, says Derek Kidner, one of the commentators. And consider this from Hebrews chapter 10 in the New Testament. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. The author is thinking about the officiants at the temple in Jerusalem. Every day, a day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins, incidentally, he says. But when this priest, Jesus, who he's been talking about the whole book, when this priest, Jesus, had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. The work is finished. The creation is accomplished. God sits down. People have been saved. The sacrifice has been made. Jesus has proclaimed, "It is finished." And he sits down at the right hand of the Father in heaven. Because it's done. That's the significance over and over again of people sitting down in the Bible. It's over. It's finished. It's completed. It's accomplished. This passage of Scripture takes me back and forth. And to think about rest is to think about work. And as we try to appreciate God's example of taking it easy after one day in 7, we need to take seriously the value of hard work and of honest labor. God is our example in this, of course, as we've said. The Bible will go on to say many worthwhile things about the importance of labor. For example, Paul says, "Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work, so that you will not be dependent on anybody." Ecclesiastes says that it's good to find satisfaction in our work. And elsewhere we're told that our work should serve others and glorify God. But work is not all about high ideals. The Bible is realistic about the fact that work is also difficult. In fact, that's a major theme of Genesis chapter 3, as one of the Bible studies has been discussing over these last 2 or 3 weeks. The ground is hard, and we have to sweat to make a living. Many times we're frustrated by our bosses or our employees or both. When our work isn't valued, we get resentful. And we struggle to find the right balance between overwork and underwork, between laziness and workaholism. So, work is both. We should analyze. There's a meeting in the library right after church. We're going to psychoanalyze this comment. Right. Work is not all about high ideals. Work is both promise and curse. Something to be enjoyed, but also something to be endured. Work is often very difficult. So many people are not blessed to be in a job they like a lot of the time. You figure out that the negatives in that sentence, yes, good. And so we need to work hard and serve faithfully as serving God and not humans. That's another word from the Bible about work. Work hard, yes, but also take a break, at least one day in 7. And in this, the Lord is our example, because on the 7th day, God rested from all his work. And then, as if it was not enough simply for God to give us his example, Genesis chapter 2, verse 3 tells us that God blessed the 7th day and made it holy. Now, we've heard about God's blessing twice already in the opening chapter of Genesis, both of animals and of people, that they would be fruitful and increase in number, that they would be successful. And sure enough, as we read our Bibles, as we consult our own experiences, we find out that God has many ways to bless his people. There are many things that happen to us, even despite all the difficulties that we run into, all the deaths that we need to take into account. We discover that God has still many ways that he blesses us, that he makes life worthwhile and important and precious and great. God makes a point, even as he creates the world in the first place, of blessing over and over and over again. And that's what God is like. Our God is a giver. Our God is constantly pouring into our laps blessing after blessing, overflowing blessings. Comes as a bit of a surprise, perhaps, after the blessing of animals and especially the blessing of people, to find out that a day is blessed, one particular day of the week. That's kind of unusual for a thing to be blessed, for a day to be blessed. It's quite unusual, and we don't get very much information about what that's all about, but I think that it's fair to conclude that those who observe the Sabbath will experience divine blessing in their lives. And those who, by contrast, relentlessly ride roughshod over a day that's meant to be playful and restful and worshipful are likely, sooner or later, to run into one kind of trouble or another. I remember in my first ministry in rural Saskatchewan, realizing that in this congregation of farming families, there were some who worked on Sundays and some who didn't. There were some who, when planting or harvesting especially came along, just sat there when the weather was great on Sunday morning and went to church instead. And when some of the others were harvesting in September or October, they would be not working, not putting all their resources on the field that day, and waiting till Monday morning, even though the forecast was a little bit iffy for Monday. And I remember one particular farmer telling me that he had been farming for 35 years, and that he had conscientiously not worked on Sunday. And that his grain was in the bin, along with everybody else's, at just about the same time, every year. That God was faithful, that God blessed those decisions. I know there are some people who need to work on Sundays. I understand that completely. I'm one. Right? But I also understand the importance of a Sabbath. That's why Monday is so special to me. When the work of Sunday is over, I love it on Monday when it's quiet. When Kath and I can go for a walk. When, well, you know the Sunday kind of feeling. The Sabbath is holy. That's what God has said here. It's a special day because the Lord who invented it is special. Because the God who made the human beings in that world had our best interests at heart and said, take a break already. Those who honor God by making this day special will discover that the rhythm of work and rest, of 6 days on and 1 day off, is a blessed gift from the Creator to the creature. But you know what? We've tarnished this gift by surrounding it with controversy. Remember, it's creation with a dash of controversy. We've tarnished this gift of the Sabbath with controversy. We've spent way too much time arguing about which day is right, whether Christians should observe the Sabbath from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, following the Old Testament and the modern Jews, or whether we should adopt the New Testament development of resting and worshiping on Sunday, the day of Christ's resurrection, sometimes renamed the Lord's Day. There are even such things as Seventh-day Baptists. Did you know that? You ever run into them? And they worship on Saturdays. We've nearly killed this day of rest by surrounding it with rules. These rules start out by helping us to keep Sunday special, but then turn it into a tyranny of death to spoil God's gift that was meant to be life-giving. I remember the example of George MacDonald. Have some of you read his fairy tales and his children's stories, his Scottish romances, or maybe, if you're not willing to admit to that, his theology and sermons, all kinds of writing. C.S. Lewis said that he had never been more positively affected towards knowing God and trusting in Jesus than all the things that George MacDonald wrote. Young George's Scottish parents were convinced that keeping the Sabbath meant staying in the house except for when you went out to church, of drawing the drapes so the sunlight and the beauty didn't get in, turning off all the lights even. Well, that might have even been, well, I don't know. And young George MacDonald, later to go on to become a great novelist, loved to read. And he would, when his parents weren't looking, climb behind the couch in the living room, slip over to the drapes that were behind the couch, and poke his book into the sunlight. And God bless him. But we've, and it's, I mean that's easy to criticize, right? But sometimes our own rules for Sunday get in the way of it being a good day and a playful day and a restful day and a worshipful day. Even Jesus managed to fall afoul of the legalists, as you can read about in the Gospels. It's amazing how many times they argue about the Sabbath, where somebody confronts him and says, you shouldn't be doing that today. When he heals somebody and he has to justify it at great length and repeatedly. He says, you'd save your ox if it fell into the ditch. Why can't I save this person? It's much more important than a farm animal. Jesus countered that legalism by saying that the Sabbath was made for our benefit, for human flourishing, and that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. That it's not an Old Testament rule that's meant to be forcefully imposed. It's a New Testament blessing that's meant to make a positive difference in our lives. Let me conclude with just a couple of short things. And that was, the first is that I was surprised to realize when someone told me about it, that the Sabbath is this 1 in 7 thing, is not something that you would have predicted from anything in the world around us. That it's a God thing. The days happen because of the earth going around and poking into the sun every 24 hours. Months happen because the moon goes around the earth and creates certain effects every month. We've tinkered with that a little, but that's where it came from in the first place. Years happen because of, you do the astronomy. But not the Sabbath. The Sabbath, 1 day in 7, came because God said, 6 days on, 1 day off. 6 days on, 1 day off. Somebody told me once that the Russians or the Soviets in decades gone past experimented with getting more work out of people by having 9 days on and 1 day off. And they experimented with different lengths of time and finally came back to the 6 on, 1 day off because their productivity got wrecked every time they tinkered with what God had suggested. It's a gift from God. There remains yet, says the book of Hebrews in chapter 4, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God, because anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his or her own work, just as God did from his. And you and I are summoned by the book of Genesis, by God's own example on the seventh day, to share God's rest, to not only take in the wonderful salvation that Jesus gives to everybody who's willing to receive it, but to take as a special gift from God this day, today.